It's a real pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker, Kevin Mitchell, who will be speaking about free agents, how life evolved the power to choose. And I promise you, Kevin, I will not be performing any magic on you.
I thought.
Kevin is an Associate Professor of Genetics and Neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin, where he's also been Dean of Undergraduate Studies since 2018. He's particularly well known for his work on conditions like schizophrenia and autism, and for his cross-disciplinary research on synesthesia, which has helped uncover its genetic development and neural foundations. His group has also identified a number of genes involved in how neurons connect during brain development, showing how changes in these genes can lead to behaviours in animal models that echo aspects of epilepsy, psychosis, and ADHD. Kevin did his PhD at UC Berkeley, followed by postdoctoral work at Stanford, and he's been a central figure in neurogenetics research ever since. Beyond the lab, he's deeply committed to science communication. He organises the Wiring the Brain conference, teaches widely, writes a popular blog, and is a very active public voice on neuroscience, genetics, and how they relate to the human experience. So we really are in for a thought-provoking talk this afternoon. So please welcome Kevin.
Oh, thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to help celebrate the Robert Boyle Winter School. And yeah, I'm going to talk about a metaphysical, philosophical issue, which is free will, but I want to approach it from a scientific point of view. So the question, the problem of free will, is an age-old one. Really, it boils down to this. Are you really in control of your actions? Do you really make decisions? And at the core of that, there's a few things we need to understand. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to have a will? But also, what does it mean to be you? What does it mean to be the type of thing that might be able to cause things to happen in the world? So really, that's a basic idea, a basic question of agency. How can an agent be in control of things? Why is it even a thing to say for any organism, not just a human being, but for any organism to say that they did something, as opposed to just stuff has happened. Stuff happened in the world, stuff happened inside them, and so on. But what did they do? Why is it right to say that the organism as a holistic entity could be a site of causal powers when it seems like for everything else in the world, everything just comes down to physics? Right? We're talking about mind and matter here. So how can it be that the mind can have anything to say over what the matter does? That really is the fundamental challenge of free will. And it's an ancient debate. It started with, for example, in ancient Greece, people like Democritus, one of the first philosophers to propose that everything in the world was made of atoms, some indivisible little stuff, and that the atoms took straight paths as they went through the world. That doesn't mean straight in the world. It just means that they were predestined to do whatever they were going to do. Now, his contemporary, or someone shortly afterwards, Epicurus, already could see the problem with this. If the atoms followed predetermined paths, then any action is actually impossible. To do something presupposes the possibility that you could not have done it. Otherwise, it's not a doing, it's just something that happened. So his proposal was that the atoms must swerve sometimes. There must be a little bit of freedom in the fundamental aspects of the physics of the world that gives some scope for agency to come into being. And I think he was spot on. However, 2,400 years later, we're still having the same debate. When we talk about free will, it's usually just opposed to the idea of determinism, where determinism can be expressed like this. The idea that facts about the remote past, in conjunction with the laws of nature, entail that there's only one unique future. So the physics just says what's going to happen, and there's no scope for anything else to happen. It's just completely predetermined along a single path. And this is two contemporary philosophers, Greg Caruso and the recently deceased Dan Dennett, and they wrote a book disagreeing with each other on what this means for free will, but they both agreed with this premise. So they both accepted the premise that the world is like this. And then Caruso ends up with free will skepticism. He says, well, if that's true, then obviously free will is just an illusion. Whereas Dan Dennett proposed what's called compatibilism, the idea that actually, yes, the world's deterministic, but we can still think of free will and moral responsibility as compatible with that. I'm not going to talk about that position. It gets a little arcane for my taste. And it's also moot because I think the world just isn't deterministic like that. So the thesis, we can restate the thesis of determinism in this sort of mathematical way like this. We can just say the state of the world, the state of the whole universe right now, let's just take this room as the whole universe, right? All the atoms, the positions and momentum of all the atoms in this room right now, if you submit them to the laws of physics, to the equations of motion and everything else, then the next state is predictable. It's completely determined, and the next, and the next, and the next. And the implication is, quite startlingly, that if you think about the entire history of the universe, right, which starts with the Big Bang here, that everything that has happened since the Big Bang, including me saying this sentence and you hearing it, was already determined at that point. Now, to me, that's just absurd on its face, and yet many people seem to take it seriously, and they seem to think that physics has shown that this must be true. So recently I published a paper with my student Henry Potter and physicist George Ellis, which aimed to show that actually physics doesn't show that that's true at all, quite the opposite. So the idea here that, the question of whether determinism holds, you can see there's a couple of conditions here. First of all, the state of the system at time t exhaustively defined, plus the laws of physics necessarily entails a single state here. So there's two questions here that we can ask, or statements that we can say, rather. First of all, it's impossible to define the state of a system with infinite precision at time t. In fact, there is no time t. There's not some instantaneous moment of no duration. There's always steps of time. And during those steps of time, things are always happening. There just is no way to define the state of the universe with infinite precision. And the way that the equations actually proceed is also not deterministic. So we know this from quantum physics. So if you think about quantum indeterminacy, it is described in two ways. The first in what's called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And this is just a mathematical statement that holds, which says that certain parameters of physical objects in the world can't both be infinitely precise at the same time. It's actually nothing to do with uncertainty or certainty. It's just a statement about the world that mathematically holds true when you get down to very small things like quantum elements. And then the second element is Schrodinger's equation, which describes the evolution of a quantum system. So we talk about all the atoms in the room like this, that could be our quantum system. And the Schrodinger equation says it will evolve in a certain way, and it's very deterministic how that proceeds until something happens, until there's some kind of an interaction, until events force the collapse of this kind of cloud of probabilities into one outcome. And that's just not deterministic. It's inherently random. So, and I think, most physicists and most general people accept that quantum physics at its core has some indeterminacy built into it. The question is, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for questions of free will and our minds and our brains? Because you can say, well, okay, quantum physics is indeterministic, but we know classical physics is deterministic, right? So things like describing the orbits of the planets, well, they're deterministic. Newton showed that that's true. And I think many people think that this is true, that when systems get big enough, they're somehow insulated from lots of randomness at lower levels. It isn't true. So classical physics by itself is not deterministic. It's just an idealization that we use that makes things handy when we're making calculations for certain kinds of things. It turns out that the solar system is particularly obliging in being extremely predictable, right? Unlike, say, the weather on the planets, not predictable at all, right? And that's because it's a more complex kind of situation. So there are lots of assumptions built into Newton's framework of classical mechanics, which allowed him to make these predictions of things like the orbits of the planets. But even he realized Even the solar system is inherently unpredictable beyond a certain time point. Little tiny variations can cause a big difference in the outcome. Okay, so even classical systems have some limits to how predictable they are, and one of those actually comes from the fact that it's, even for classical things, impossible to define the state of the system with infinite precision. And the reason for this is a little is going to sound odd, because we don't normally think about things in this way, but it's basically because you can't have infinite information in a finite space. So if the state of the world at any moment specified every future state, that means it contains infinite information about what's going to happen. Well, you can't pack infinite information into a finite space without causing a black hole. That's what the Bekenstein bound implies here. So as a matter of physics, it's just impossible for there to be infinite information in some finite space, especially because the universe is expanding. And so as it expands, the possibility space increases. There's new space where things can happen, and the equilibration of all the stuff is slower than the expansion of the universe. So we have an increase in information as time goes on. What that means is that the future is really open. It's not predetermined by the state of the universe at any particular moment. So these are just a couple of quotes from philosophers of physics, basically reiterating the fact that physics has not shown that the world is deterministic. It's not a result of physics. It's an interpretation, but it's a mistaken one. The upshot is something like this. The state of a system at time t, plus the laws of physics, doesn't necessitate a single state. It defines a possibility space. Many things could happen at the next time point, and because of that, many more things could happen at the time point beyond that. So you get this expanding space of possibilities as we proceed into the future. Okay, now, that sounds hopeful for the question of free will. At least it means the future is open, possibilities exist, right? And not everything is foreclosed already. But it doesn't obviously explain how we could be in charge of things, because it seems like we have a dilemma. Either the things that we do are determined by all of the movements of the atoms within us, which are deterministic, so in which case we don't have free will, or they're determined by the movements of atoms within us, some of which are random, in which case I'm not in charge of the way random quantum events go inside my brain. So how am I in charge of that kind of what happens, right, at a macroscopic level? So what I want to do is suggest a different way of thinking about this. So the top line here is the sort of deterministic scenario where just one thing is happening. Right? There's no branching here into the future. It's just a sacred timeline that continues. There's another way of thinking about this, which we call determinism plus randomness. And the idea here is that, okay, most things are deterministic, but every once in a while, some random event happens. Some little atom zigs instead of zags. And when it does that, at some point like this, then something happens at the macroscopic scale. I turn left or right, whatever it is, right? So the idea is you have a basically determinism by default, and it's interrupted by these little burps of randomness from somewhere that cause things, right? Now, I'm not doing any of that, right? I'm not doing the random burping. That's just happening inside my brain. So how can that give me free will? It doesn't seem like it can. The thing that is based on is this idea that the randomness is something extra, right? It's something added that disturbs the normally deterministic goings-on within the universe. But it's not. It's not a positive thing. It's a negative thing. There aren't just sprinklings of randomness over the normal things. It's just that everything is a bit underdetermined. Right? There's a lack of complete determination based on the low-level laws of physics. Many things could happen. Now, that looks very different than this determinism plus randomness, and it's a situation we call pervasive indefiniteness, for want of a better term. Really, it means an underdetermination of the future where things get fuzzier and fuzzier, this cone of possibilities. Now, that gives a different kind of a view for free will, and it gets back to Epicurus himself, who said that his little swerves, right, these swerves of atoms all the time, would loosen the treaties of fate. What that means is that your actions are not predetermined by your physical state at any moment. many options are open to you. And because the causation is not exhausted at the low levels, it gives some scope for macroscopic organization to have an influence, which wouldn't be the case if everything was already determined by just the laws of physics. There would be no room for any extra causation, but there is. So the way a system is organized can have causal influence over the way that the system evolves, because all the causation is not exhausted at this low level. And we think about, causes in terms of physical forces, like things that push into each other, that give a little oomph to something. But actually, there's another kind of a cause, which is a constraint. So it works by stopping things from happening. It works by limiting the possibility space, right? And the way that something is organized can limit the possibilities of what happens. So those constraints can be enabling, and that's especially true, it gets really interesting, when you get selection for certain kinds of organizations, right? Certain ways that the system could be organized at a macroscopic level that can do things. One of the things that organization can do is persist, right? Some organizations are more stable than others. So they can propagate themselves into the future, and that's what we call living. That's what living things do. So here's Schrödinger, again, wrote this book, What is Life? It's based on some lectures he delivered at Trinity in the 1940s, where he took a physicist's view of life, and he asked, well, what is this? Life seems to resist or contradict the second law of thermodynamics, which states that things should fall apart. Things should just go to equilibrium with the universe. And living things keep themselves out of equilibrium with the universe. They keep themselves apart. And they do it by taking in energy and doing work to maintain the organization of the whole pattern. That's just what it means to be a living thing, is to do some work to keep making yourself happen. Out of all the things that could happen in the world, the most likely one of which is your dissolution, you have to prevent that. So we can think of living things as these self-sustaining engines, which are really a pattern. It's not the stuff that's alive, right? The stuff is in flux. The atoms in this little bacterium here are in flux. They're in and out of it all the time. What's maintained is the pattern there. And that's a holistic, self-reinforcing regime of constraints that just is what it means to be that thing. That's the pattern of a little bacterium. I have a pattern of me, you have a pattern of you, and so on. So that requires work to maintain. You can see that our little bacterium, this single-celled creature, has a barrier between it and the world, right? So there's an inside and an outside, and it's trying to keep all its metabolism going in this way inside. The problem is the world is not cooperating, right? Things change in the world. And so a good trick to maintain stability is to get some information about what's out in the world, and then to change something, to be adaptable inside to keep alive in a world that keeps on changing. And bacteria do that, for example, by reconfiguring their metabolism, depending on what food is available, but they also can do something more profound, which is move. They can act in the world. So even simple things like bacteria will, if they sense a food source like a yummy sugar, will move towards it. If they sense dangerous things, toxic chemicals or high temperature or something, they'll move away from it. Right? So the bacterium can get information about what's out in the world through these little receptors on its surface and then send information inside. And the causation here is not physical in the sense of a transfer of energy. There's no energy being transferred. There's no matter being transferred. There's just a little wiggle inside the cell that is informational. It says X or Y or Z is out in the world, do something about it, right? And it's connected because now we have something in the world once life evolved that was never there before, which is purpose. Genuine purpose. The purpose of this thing is to stay alive. Because of that, the information has value and it has meaning relative to that goal of persisting. And we can have a scientific way of talking about those things. There's nothing supernatural about that. There's nothing out of bounds of talking about purpose and meaning within a scientific kind of milieu. Now, when you think about what's going on here, you can kind of think about it from an engineering point of view as what we call a control policy. So our little bacterium has a control policy, which is if you detect A, in this case a sugar, then do X. Move towards it, right? And that's a simple kind of a thing. You could build a robot that does something like that, right? But it embodies a pragmatic knowledge about the world, which is that moving towards X has turned out to be a good thing in the past for all my ancestors, so I'm going to do it too, right? Now, bacterium's not thinking about it. Evolution wires this into the biochemistry. But it's more complicated than that. It's not just a simple unidirectional kind of response like a reflex. It can be conditioned by other things. So you can have control policies that are context dependent. So if A is the case and B is the case, but not C, then do X, right? And those kinds of things can be wired into the biochemistry of a single-celled organism as well, which now means that what's happening is the whole organism is assessing a situation. It's not just an isolated individual stimulus response kind of a machine. It's a holistic sort of a machine. And you can illustrate that by thinking about, well, actually looking inside the bacterium to see what's actually going on when it detects a sugar out in the world. And so that X there is a sugar, and it's got a little protein molecule that it's detected with. And then there's a pathway inside it, which ultimately impinges on this, what's called a flagellum. It's like the little outboard motor that our bacterium uses to move around. If you only saw this picture, then you would think, well, the bacterium's not doing anything here. Something is happening within it, and it's being pushed around by its parts, right? So inside it, it's very mechanistic, it's very reductive. We can isolate the specific parts that are doing this job. It seems like the bacterium is passive, and it's just a stimulus response. But that's an artifact of the way that these experiments are done, where all of the context is held constant. It's the only thing that the bacterium is seeing when we're studying it in a lab like this. So it's a kind of a view that looks like this on the top, where, there's nothing else there in the environment. So of course it's only responding to that. But actually, these bacteria, they live in our gut, which are incredibly complicated environments. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. And if you want to see the real or closer picture of what's actually happening, it's more like this. So the bacterium is responding to all kinds of different chemicals all at once. And it's responding to them in a way that depends on other factors, like how many other cells are around, what's the temperature, what's the osmolarity, and what's my history. What was just the case just before this? That's how bacteria actually know if they're moving up a gradient or down a gradient. They do a kind of a temporal integration. So this is a really different picture, right? It's not a mechanistic picture. It's a picture of an organism actively accommodating new information in the world and making sense of it to adapt to its conditions. So right from the get-go of living organisms, I would argue that agency is baked in. Living organisms just are agents. Now, of course, bacteria are fairly simple agents. They don't do lots of complicated things. But once multicellular life evolved, then we got stuff more interesting. So multicellular organisms face the same challenges as a bacterium. They need to know what's out in the world and what should I do about it. And the way that they've achieved that is by redeveloping this idea of sensors and motors, except on a scale of a whole organism. Right? So they have sense organs, they have muscles, and they have a control system, which of course is the nervous system. And the nervous system is really the key to our flexible agency and our individual ability to control what we do through time. So the nervous system evolved almost with the earliest animals. Once you get past sponges, you already have animals with nervous systems that are fairly simple. And of course, they rely on these elements of neurons. And neurons really are information processors. And you can think about a neuron as having this cell body, and then it collects information here, and it sends an electrical signal down here to excite other neurons. That's the usual kind of cartoon of thinking about what neurons are doing as these electrochemical relays. But that gives a kind of a faulty impression. And I think it gives this impression that there's really a driving force here, that what's happening is that neuron A is driving its downstream targets in a way that they don't have any say in the matter. And I think that picture comes from thinking about like simple reflexes and so on, where it arguably holds. But for most kinds of things that are happening in our brains, it's completely backwards. It has the relationship exactly backwards in terms of where the causation is happening. It makes you think that everything's just like a robot. The real pattern, the real picture, is more like what's on the bottom here. Neuron B is the one that's doing something here. It's interpreting its inputs, and not just one input. It's probably getting lots of different inputs, and it has some criteria for when it's going to fire. And it may be wired in such a way that if neuron A fires, it fires, but it may require two neurons impinging at the same time for it to fire. So it will carry different information depending on the way that these synaptic connections are actually configured. So it's doing a job of extracting meaning from its inputs and reporting that to the rest of the nervous system. So it's trying to figure out what's going on out there and what should I do about it. And Peter Tse, a neuroscientist and philosopher, has called this criterial causation. The idea is that the way that the system is configured, the organization of the system, embodies some criteria for each neuron about what it's interested in and what information it's going to extract from its inputs and report to whoever's listening, basically. So you can think that these criteria, where the sensitivity of these synaptic connections is incredibly plastic. That's the point of them, is to be tunable. And they're tunable in ways that reflect things like the past history, things that you've learned, your current state, like whether you're hungry or not, simple things like that will tune these neurons. Top-down constraints, what you're thinking about, goals that you may have thought of, and neuromodulation, like for things like dopamine and acetylcholine and stuff like that. All of these are reasons. All of these embody reasons. This is just how having a reason affects what you do. It's through this physical instantiation. It's not magic. These are just that's the machinery of neurons. That's what the nervous system is really for. So now you can wire in simple control policies into the nervous system, just like you could in the bacterial system. But now something else is there. Now you have the possibility to learn. And the nervous system is of course, designed for that. So we can have these kinds of pragmatic control policies, but also this sort of thing where you get, rather than having the case be, if I detect A, I should do X. Instead, we've got systems whose job it is, if they detect A, to just report A. Just say A is the case. And then the rest of the world, the rest of the system can figure out what to do with that, integrating with lots of other information. So that kind of reporting to multiple systems means we're now talking about systems that represent things out in the world. They're about something. They have meaningful patterns in play in the nervous system. It's not just electrical impulses driving. They're patterns that mean something to the organism. Okay, the other thing is you can get, obviously, a link to prior knowledge, right? We're not in every moment just interpreting things from first principles. We build up knowledge about what the world is like. We build a model of the world through paying attention to things as they have happened to us in the past, and we build a model of the world and a model of ourselves. And what that lets us do is, in any circumstance, make a prediction of what would be a good thing to do. I understand the causal relations in the world. I understand the scenario that I'm in because I've been in similar scenarios in the past. I can make a prediction of the outcomes of various options. I can weigh them against each other, and I can pick the one that I think is going to turn out the best. And that's basically how thinking works and how decision-making works. Through these different steps where we assess an external situation, we integrate that with our internal states and our drives and our goals, what we want to do at any moment. Think of some possible actions, evaluate those in this sort of internal competition, release one of those, we're acting, and then we're paying attention, right? So most of our actions are not instantaneous. If we have some goal, we have to keep acting in order to achieve that goal. So we have to pay attention, we have to monitor that, and then we have to learn from it, and the cycle starts again. So we're in control of what's happening in those scenarios. Okay, so we've gotten away from the idea that physics is determining what we do, and instead you can see we have a system that allows us to adjudicate over our reasons for doing various things in any given scenario, and then output some possible action. Now, it's also possible to say, well, maybe that's deterministic. Maybe even though there's some low-level quantum fluctuations and so on, maybe they don't affect the big thing, and maybe the way your brain makes a decision at any moment is actually determined by all of your past reasons. And this is an argument that neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky makes, for example. And the idea there, if you think about it, is really that actually each action that you would make is already pre-statable. In any scenario, you could say, inevitably, the outcome of cognition will be this one thing. There was never any choice. You were always going to do this one thing. There's no evidence for that. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense because it boils down to the determinism that we were already kind of talking about. It really relates to this question of when are decisions determined. So if they're determined at time t, this idea when you're exposed to a stimulus, if it's already the case that these cognition processes will always lead to one thing, then effectively it's already statable at that point. The only way that could be true is if the thing was completely physically deterministic, which it isn't. It's very noisy. So really, it's decided, when we're making a decision, it's not already decided when we're faced with a decision. We decide it through deliberating, and at the end of that process, that's when things get determined by us, by thinking about it. So this period of deliberation is genuinely open. These decisions are not physically predetermined in the sense that multiple things could happen, physically speaking, and what I want to do is make happen what I want to happen out of the possible things that are in play. Okay, so it doesn't mean they're not determined, and they're also not just subject to random events happening. It's not this picture, right, where an atom zigs or zags that determines what I do. It's this picture where I'm determining what I do, but I'm using noisy components, right? We shouldn't think of the randomness as these extra little burps. It's just this underdetermination. It's a background condition in which I'm operating. I've got a brain where noisy stuff is happening. I'm trying to do the best I can to make the best decision with uncertain, incomplete information, and these components that are pretty good, but they're definitely not so good that they'd always do the same thing. So if you think, in any given situation, if you wound the tape back, could you have done otherwise? Well, yes, in the sense that these processes might have gone one way or the other. The point is that whatever way they went, that was you doing that. That was you deciding it. Okay, so to summarize then, this question of mind and matter, the fundamental indeterminacy of the matter at the lowest level means, first of all, that the future is open. And secondly, it gives some scope for the organization of a system to have some causal power over what happens to the stuff within it. So we have that causal slack. It gives an opportunity for macroscopic control. And living organisms are macroscopic systems that do work to make things happen. They make themselves happen in the first case, but they continue to do that by making things happen in the world. And they've evolved very sophisticated control systems to allow them to act in the world in ways that favor their own persistence. And in humans, those systems have been elaborated to such an extent that they qualify, in my mind, for what we call free will, acting for reasons, even being able to interrogate our reasons, being able to reason about our reasons, and so on. So that's the kind of system that allows us to have control over ourselves and to act as truly as causal agents in the world. So I'll leave it there, and that's just some related work. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. There's a lot to digest there. And we do have a couple of minutes so we can take some questions from the floor.
Thank you very much. So it's all very complicated, so forgive me. I don't think I really understood the idea why our brain is not deterministic. Because to me, I can understand that it can be a very complicated machine, but still a machine. So if you're saying that it's not deterministic, is this decision that we make, is it something supernatural? Does it have to be something supernatural? Or is it something natural? But then I cannot understand why it's not deterministic. Yeah.
Right. So there's a couple ways to think about this. you could say that the way our brain works is deterministic because the low-level stuff that it's made out of is deterministic, right? So that's the idea that physics just says there's only one thing that could happen. Physics doesn't say that, so that's not the case, right? But you can make another argument, which is that our brain is deterministic in spite of, not because of, in spite of low-level stuff that's happening, right? And that kind of relies on the idea of what's called the law of large numbers, which is you can have lots of noisy stuff, but if you average over that at a macroscopic scale, you'll have something fairly deterministic happening, right? We rely on that principle to design things like computers, right? There's all sorts of noisy stuff that could happen in here. The computer's specifically designed to buffer that noise and make sure that it works fairly deterministically and it does what we want it to do, right? That's because the computer doesn't have a say in the matter. It's not an agent, right? It's just a device. However, for more complicated things, we can have these systems that evolve that allow us to act for reasons. And then the question is, within the scope of scenarios that we might encounter, is it right to say we're just being driven by one reason or another? And if there were only ever one thing going on in the world at a time, then you could say, well, there's this reflex, there's this one, and so on, right? But that's not how the world presents itself. It presents itself as lots of things happening. I've got lots of goals happening at the same time. I need to adjudicate over short-term and long-term things, various motivations and desires, and complicated information, right? So what I need is an internal system to allow me to make an all things considered judgment over all that information that I'm getting. Now, you could say, well, okay, that's fine. You just submit the information to the algorithm and the weights of the algorithm determine what happens. That kind of presumes that the weights of the algorithm are already set. And in fact, what happens, what cognition is actually doing is setting those weights, right? Because we encounter things we've never encountered before. The system is not pre-wired to know what to do in every situation. So in a new situation where we have these two goals, we've never held both of them before in our life. Now we have to weight them against each other given new information, right? That's what cognition is doing. It's an open process. It's not pre-statable. And it's doing it with noisy components and uncertain information and so on. So the only way that it could be really deterministic at a macro level is if it were deterministic at the micro level, which it isn't. That's the argument. Yeah. Let me show you one thing, just to impress on you, I guess, the fact that this is not these simple reflexes. This is a sort of a picture of some of our systems that we use for action selection. It's a very simple cartoon. The next picture is also a simple cartoon, but it's a little closer to reality. So these are some of the brain systems, and each of these little rectangles there could have millions of neurons within it in complicated internal circuitry. Right? All of this system is trying to weigh up our motivations, our internal states, our knowledge about the world, our predictions about our actions, our goals and things that we're holding in place at the same time. And it's all trying to come to a sort of a global resolution of this tension that says, okay, right now, this is the best thing you can do, best thing you can think to do. But the idea that it could be deterministic from the get-go, I think this sort of picture undercuts that intuition, I hope.
Thanks, that's so interesting. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, what is the difference between a super complex deterministic model versus something that's not deterministic? Is it just that we don't have enough information? There's so many variables there that we couldn't possibly summarize all the variables.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, okay, there's a couple things going on there. So, first of all, at the neural level, the question is not what we could know; it's what the brain can know, right? So, the brain has noisy components. When a neuron fires and another one is listening to it, it might or might not fire. This is sort of a probabilistic event, and it's made of components that are jiggling around at quantum scales, basically interacting with each other and coming apart and so on. All of that is probabilistic. It's not a deterministic kind of physical system. So the stuff that it's made out of is fundamentally indeterministic at low levels. Now, the question is, like, what does that mean for the way the whole thing works at a big level? Right? We don't care about quantum fluctuations in the brain. The idea is not that a single quantum event is going to cause you to do one thing or another. Right? I guess the way to think about it is that this is a bit more like a weather system than like the orbits of the planets in terms of the complexity of it, right? So there are sensitivities within here to how the systems go one way or another. And in fact, most brain areas operate in a regime that's called criticality or near criticality, which means they're very sensitive to their inputs. That's their whole job, is to be responsive to one bit of information versus another, and then say yay or nay, and they report their outputs and so on. So if you imagine that happening over, billions and billions of neurons and these different areas, each carrying different information, then, as I said, you can work backwards to say, well, the only way that could be deterministic is if it had completely reliable deterministic components, and it doesn't.
To control of complex behavior, one is drawn to the conclusion that that must be partly unconscious or intuitive, because you can't be doing all that consciously.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So, that gets really interesting. So when people talk about free will and us being in control of things, they often have in their mind an idea that you're doing something only if you've consciously deliberated about it. And most of our decisions, most of our behavior is not conscious at all, for a very good reason that you just put your finger on. It would take way too long to make a conscious deliberative decision over every little thing that you do. So we don't. And if you think of behavioral control as something that's extended through time, then what you've done when you develop habits, for example, policies, ways of behaving in the world, is you've learned from past experience and you've cached that knowledge in the structure of your brain in a ways that is just an extremely efficient way to guide your behavior in the future. You don't have to think about it every day. When you wake up in the morning, you don't have to be bewildered and say, what should I do now, right? You just know you should have breakfast or whatever it is, right? So most of our behavior is, in a sense, subconscious or automatic, habitual. That doesn't mean we're not in charge of it. If you think of yourself as this thing that's extended through time, not just this instantaneous physical thing right now. And I think that, for me, that's the kind of a crucial view here, is if you're thinking about a living organism, whether it's a human being or a bacterium, the life of the organism is the continuity through time, being itself through time. And that involves learning from the past and using that to guide your behavior towards your future. Yeah.